I moved into Heartfield Commons because I wanted quiet. That's the honest truth. A place with decent trees, a mailbox that didn't rattle, a porch where I could drink coffee without feeling like I was performing for somebody. 3 months in, someone tried to tell me the patch of lawn under my maple belonged to the homeowner's board, and that if I didn't move a single Adirondack chair by dusk, I'd owe a fine that would keep me up at night. That was the hook. The moment you realize the rules in a place like this aren't about grass, they're about control. I learned their names quick. Margot Hale ran the board with the kind of smile that knew exactly which words to leave unsaid. She wore linen blouses and drove a sedan so polished it looked like it might reflect the moral compass of anyone who crossed her. Lucas Reed handled things that needed hands-on attention. He fixed fences and fixed troubles. Neighbors introduced themselves in that way people do in neighborhoods. Short, practical, smiles measured like payments. I introduced myself as Daniel Mercer, 43, moved from a small town upstate where people learned to mind their own business, and then, sometimes, to mind everyone else's. I told them I repaired HVAC units, which was half true, and I kept my real work to myself. There are benefits to quiet. There are benefits to blending in. At first, it was small. A polite note about my dog's nails being 2 millimeters too long, the sort of petty precision that makes you laugh, because who measures dog nails? Then a letter about my mailbox color not being within the covenant. I paid the fines I didn't know because sometimes it's cheaper to swallow pride than to open a war you don't yet know the shape of. But the ledger of small humiliations grew, not in a steady line, but like cracks in plaster, fine by fine, jab by jab, and suddenly the whole wall was compromised. The escalation was patient, clinical. Tires slashed at night. A smear of red paint across my garage door that cleaned off with soap, but left a taste in my mouth that didn't rinse away. A neighbor's garden gnome placed dead center on my driveway with a post-it. Property lines matter. When I started to put up a cheap security camera facing the driveway, Margot called me not in a friendly way, but in the way someone calls a neighbor to remind them they're being watched by the community, and that the community has consequences. "You're new, Daniel," she said, voice like polished glass. "We look out for each other here. Sometimes that means enforcing what we agreed to." It wasn't a question. It was an assignment. I started to document things because that's my default. When you spend a life fixing broken thermostats and reading meters, you get into the habit of reading signs, of noting small changes that mean larger problems. I learned to take photos with timestamps, to save texts, to ask in a casual way if someone could tell me when they'd seen something. Mrs. Kaplan, who lived 2 doors down and kept her curtains open enough to let a historian read the weather, handed me an envelope in the middle of the night. "You be careful," she said. "She's sharp." Inside, a list of fines Margot had levied over the years, amounts that didn't add up to significant paperwork, but added up, in total, to a kind of quiet tyranny. Mrs. Kaplan's notes had names and dates, and in the margins, little observations. Margot likes the word compliance, uses it like a prayer. Board meetings are short. Decisions are shorter. The neighbors who spoke quietly in parking lots and grocery aisles told me the same thing in different ways. Margot's rules always found their way to people who were just a little too different. People who had the audacity to plant a native shrub instead of a convenience-approved ornamental. People who left holiday lights up a day too long. There was a pattern. Pressure, isolation, fines, a swift erosion of will. When you collect evidence, you find it changes your posture toward a place. Heartfield stopped being a set of pretty roofs and became a problem that needed proper mapping. I kept a notebook, not a dramatic ledger, but a careful list. Dates, times, who was there. I installed cameras that captured more than just trespass. One angle caught the corner of Margot's sedan pulling back from the curb the night my tires were cut. Another camera captured Lucas standing in the alley as a group of men moved something across my backyard. They thought they were unseen. They were not. There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes from believing you can own a community. Margot believed it. She believed in precedent the way a preacher believes in scripture. Adjust the message and the flock would follow. Community standards, she'd say at meetings, lips pursed as if standards were the same as mercy. She had a way of making rules sound like virtue, and virtue sound like vendetta. When I asked, quietly, whether the board could fine someone for something subjective, she smiled like a courtroom judge. "We follow our covenants," she said, and left off the part where covenants become tools. One night, Lucas's men who did not live in Heartfield but had reasons to be useful cut the softwood posts I had used to secure my garden trellis. They left the posts on the lawn and a note. "Next time, move what's yours." When I found the posts, I did what folks do. I took pictures. I spoke to neighbors who had been watching from their windows. A young couple, Marcus and Jenna, said they'd heard laughter, men talking about sending a message. Their hands trembled a little when they spoke. People who've been bullied speak in small truths, like little bandaged confessions. What pushed me was not the broken trellis so much as the way people started to withdraw. Mrs. Kaplan stopped leaving the house at times she used to, because the board sent a letter saying her bird feeder violated a view covenant, a thing that seemed laughable until you watched an 80-year-old woman fold in on herself. The Johnsons put their portrait of a harvest festival away because Margot's board had a rule about the size of front door decorations. I saw the slow shrinking and realized Margot's reach wasn't just about fines. It was about teaching people to be ashamed of small freedoms. Standing at that crossroads, I had 2 options. Escalate into a noisy fight with someone who had built a machine to punish, or do the methodical, boring work of proof. I chose the latter. That's my personality, and, if I'm honest, my vanity. I like being the person who notices the details nobody else does. It gave me something like purpose. I started to collect the types of proof lawyers salivate over dates, repeated patterns, eyewitnesses. One evening, Margot organized a neighborhood barbecue. She wanted to show warmth. She wanted to show unity, and the crowd of neighbors, half curious, half exhausted by the tension, came. She stood with a lemonade in hand, and the light hit her face in that particular way leaders like to curate. I walked in like any neighbor, carrying a potato salad, keeping it casual. Conversation was small, community small talk, and then Margot circled me with the slow precision of someone who knows how to command attention. "You were going to move that chair on the maple patch?" she said, loud enough for more ears than mine. "Yes," I said. "Tonight." She smiled and said, "Good," like someone who's taught people to say good when they ought to say no thanks or you're wrong. The men who were marginally working for her laughed at the kind of jokes that are meant to keep people off balance. Lucas came up behind her and said, "We're keeping Heartfelt the way it's supposed to be." That night, after everyone left and the lights went down, the security footage caught Lucas's sedan returning, men unloading a packet of letters addressed to various neighbors. The letters were anonymous threats: conform, or else. The footage showed one of the men laughing, but what you notice on second watch is how Margot's hand rests on Lucas's arm as if to steady him, to claim the action by our association. It's the small gestures that reveal the architecture of command. I took that footage to Sheriff Alvarez. I did not go in dramatic fashion, because the kind of narrative I was building had to look credible in the cold light of paperwork. Sheriff Alvarez, a man with weathered skin and a low voice, watched the footage without blinking. "This looks like intimidation," he said. "It looks like a vendetta dressed up as governance." He couldn't act on a video alone, and I knew that. The law is patient when it's right, but it takes paper and corroboration. Sheriff Alvarez suggested I keep collecting, which was equal parts relief and armchair. He agreed to a covert detail to watch certain moments, to be present if things turned to criminal. That thought law enforcement watching quietly like a second safety net gave neighbors who had been hiding a new courage. You could see it in the way Marcus and Jenna began to answer my texts with fuller sentences. We called a meeting, not a board meeting, but a neighborhood meeting. The old community center smelled of coffee and vinyl chairs. Neighbors shuffled in, clutching their own small evidence texts, letters, photographs. I remember Mrs. Kaplan's hands, the tremor in them when she set a stack of faded letters on the table. "I thought I was losing my mind," she said, and everyone in the room knew exactly what she meant. It was in that room that the narrative turned. Margot showed up as she always did for big social moments, lettering smile, hair in place, a support system of board members acting like ceremonial pallbearers of the old order. She called the meeting unsanctioned, threatened to fine anyone participating for organization against the board, and then looked surprised when hands rose to present evidence. She had a way of acting shocked that seemed rehearsed. "You're making accusations," she said, and the room heard the foghorn of someone about to aim a cannon. A man named Philip, who'd been a quiet neighbor and a contractor before a job took him elsewhere, stood and played an audio clip on his phone, a recording of Lucas instructing men to teach him a lesson. The sound was tinny, but the intent was unmistakable. Heads turned. Margot's face shifted, a shadow crossing that she had not scheduled for public view. "That's taken out of context," she said. She always used context like a shield. But the room had a new strength. What was once whispers in grocery store lines turned into voices, and voices make trouble for rulers who rely on silence. Sarah from across the lane handed me a text chain. "If we keep billing them, they'll stop." It read a kind of queasy directive to impose pressure on selected homes to collect fines until they capitulated. The chain had a Margot signature. The board's veneer cracked. The showdown we all imagined was not a single cinematic thunderbolt. It was a slow, furious accumulation until a threshold was crossed. That threshold came after a night when someone, in the middle of the week, keyed every car parked on Mr. Patel's side of the street. The damage cost thousands, and when Sheriff Alvarez's office was notified, they widened the net. We handed over footage, timelines, receipts. The sheriff's team coordinated with county prosecutors, and they began to subpoena records. Margot's neat ledger of fines, when placed against tax records and contractor invoices, started to look less like administration and more like a small-scale racketeering enterprise. Margot's response was textbook: deny, distract, delegitimize. She organized a town hall meeting in the community hall, advertised as a clarification session, and invited everyone to come and be reassured. She prepared slides, which she called clarifying materials, and a projector that would show pictures of the neighborhood's history, achievements. The annual bake sale and emotional architecture meant to shield her actions. I sat in the back, not to be dramatic, but because it's easier to watch a leader when you're not part of their circle. When Margot stood up to speak, she did that practiced sweep of the room, smiling and nodding. She had a line, polished. "We have a covenant to protect the property values that benefit us all." It's the kind of rhetoric that sounds good until you ask who benefits and how. I set up a laptop, and before she could begin her projection, I asked for the room's attention. Saying, "Excuse me," is less than 1,000 words, but it's also the first act of refusing to be politely erased. I played a compilation of the footage: the sedan returning at night, Lucas with the men in the alley, the anonymous letters being dropped off into neighbors' mailboxes. I played Philip's audio. I played a clip of a voice that turned out to be one of Margot's closest associates confessing in a private message that, "We've got people scared. That's the point." The room went quiet in that way silence does when it realizes it has been lied to. Margot's face, which had been composed, reddened a little like varnish heating. She tried to speak, but people were already coming forward. Marcus, who trembled earlier, read from a ledger of payments that matched a contractor list payments routed through shell companies, invoices that didn't align with work done. Mrs. Kaplan's letters, once laughable, read like a history of intimidation. Lucas tried to stand, his jaw clenched as if he were holding a baseball in the back of his throat. Daniel, Margot said, and by then her voice had that edge of someone who'd been unseated. This is slander. It's footage, I said. It's audio. It's messages. It's money trails. That's when Sheriff Alvarez walked in. He had the courtesy to let the room settle and the lack of ceremony to let the law do the talking. Deputies followed, quietly, thoughtfully. If you've never seen a person realize their world is closing in, it's a thing both anticlimactic and immense. Margot's hands began to wind, as if adjusting the shape of a hat that no longer fit. Lucas looked like someone realizing they'd paid to get the engine running, and now the engine had seized. The sheriff did not arrest Margot on the spot. The law's gears are careful. There were questions to answer, subpoenas to serve. But they did serve notices and take statements, and they led Lucas out of the room to answer questions at the station. Margot's reign collapsed, not in a single dramatic topple, but in audits, filings, and people rediscovering their right to a bird feeder. There were lawsuits and settlements and public meetings where the word democracy was used with more than polite humor. We reformed the board, tightened oversight ironically, more transparency than the old regime ever promised. There were apologies, small and awkward, and there were people who left Heartfelt because once you've watched the fabric of a place show its weak seams, staying feels different. I want to be honest about my role because I've heard versions of this story where the protagonist is a saint or a meddler. I am neither. I was a neighbor who got tired of watching people shrink. I was someone who'd lived a life of careful observation and decided this time to turn that into action. I did not want fame, and I did not want to be the person who stood on a box and declaimed moral superiority. I wanted to restore a place where an old woman could keep her bird feeder without fear of formal retribution. There are things I regret: the nights I spent rewriting my timeline, the way I sometimes let paranoia sneak into humor. There are things I'm relieved about: the neighbors who came forward, the transcripts that matched the footage, the deputies who took notes like they were doctors diagnosing a patient. The truth is messy and bureaucratic and often quieter than the stories people like to tell. Heroism, if it exists here, lived in those small acts, sending an email of proof, bringing a friend to a meeting, standing up and saying, "I saw this," when it would have been easier to look away. One scene I still see in my head is not the sheriff's handcuffs or Margot's brief public bewilderment. It's Mrs. Kaplan in her kitchen, making tea, and sliding a postcard across the table that had, once, been a map of her garden. "We can plant a new bed," she said. She wasn't asking permission. She was reclaiming something. It felt like the moment after a storm when you notice the sky is clearer, a small litany of recovery. There are ethical tightropes in all of this. People asked me why I didn't go public sooner, why I didn't film a dramatic takedown video. It's paperwork that prevents crooked invoicing. It's bylaws that ensure votes are counted. It's people learning to keep their doors open again. I want to talk about motive, because critics will say Margot was protecting property values and acting in what she believed was the common good. That's a part of the story, one that's slippery and morally complicated. There are people who argue that strict aesthetic rules keep neighborhoods tidy and investment safe. They have a point when it comes to a resale market. The problem is when that rationale is weaponized to punish difference, to extract money from those least able to fight back, or to consolidate social power. When a rule becomes an instrument, it stops being governance and starts being domination. What does this mean for other neighborhoods? It means cultivate neighbors who will speak up. It means take the boring route, document, file, and rely on institutions that still function when given evidence. I don't say this as a moral lecture. I say it as someone who found the muscle of persistence worked better than the impulse to dramatize. There is a finality and an ambiguity to how Heartfelt healed. The board was re-elected under new rules. People planted native shrubs again, and someone put up a mailbox painted blue, not by committee, but by a committee of one. If there's a cinematic beat that satisfies, it's not the police clip. It's when a group of us pushed for a new covenant clause that required open minutes and a transparency clause for board spending. We argued, debated, and some of us, including me, lost votes that felt petty and painful. Democracy, even in a cul-de-sac, is not a tidy movie resolution. It's a constant argument about who counts and how much trust we place in each other. That's the open ending I wanted. Not a neat moral, but a question. Was the line between community and coercion clear? Did we do the right thing by bringing law into the neighborhood? Was there a way we could have resolved it without subpoenas and late-night footage? Hit the comment and tell me. When does order become oppression, and who gets to decide? If this story compelled you, share it with someone who lives in a string of houses where the rules feel heavier than the roofs. If it annoyed you, share that too. Honest feedback is why these conversations matter. And if you like the way this played out, follow along. There are more neighborhood stories than you'd think, and each one teaches something about what it means to belong. I didn't come here to be a hero. I came here to have coffee on my porch and to sleep without the noise of community politics gnawing at my throat. Somewhere along the way, those two things became the same fight. We won something, not perfection, but a place where Mrs. Kaplan can hang her bird feeder back up without a note in her mailbox telling her she's wrong for loving what she loves. That's enough for now.